Everyone. How is everyone tonight? Good, good. Awesome. Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all to tonight's event, Groundings on Revolutionary Pan-Africanism and Anti-Imperialist Politics. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm sure this will be an amazing and insightful discussion. So, my name is Riley Park. I've been an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation since 2019, one of the member organizations of the Indy Lib Center, as well as Free Shaka Shakur, Answer Indiana, Focus Reentry, Indiana Black Librarians Network, Hope Packages, Arte Mexicano of Indiana, and Focus Family Initiatives. So, I'm also a graduate student at UIndy, and I'll be your host and moderator for tonight's event. So with me tonight are our very special guests. So first is Musa Springer, is a cultural worker, community organizer, and journalist from Atlanta. They are the international youth representative for Cuba's Red Barrio, Afro Descent, and a longtime member of the Walter Rodney Foundation. As a journalist, they have reported on the prison and other grassroots struggles and produced several documentaries, including Parchman Prison, Pain and Protest. They host the Groundings podcast and are assistant editor for peer-reviewed journal Pamoja. Excuse me. Springer's book, Alive and Paranoid, will be published spring of 2024 through Ishka Books. Yeah. Our second guest, Erica Caines, is a coordinating committee vice chair of the Black Alliance for Peace, serves as co-coordinator of the BAP Haiti Americas team, and also as coordinator of the BAP Baltimore Citywide Alliance. Erica is a member of the Black working class centered Ujima's People's Progress Party in Maryland, and is founded Liberation Through Reading. Erica is a co-editor of revolutionary African blog Hood Communists. Her writings feature in publications like Black Agenda Report, Orokono Tribute, Monthly Review, and the Hampson Institute, as well as the anthology Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball, and a Global Economy, a project of the Sanctions Kill campaign. The next guest, the King Trill, is a few years removed from incarceration, is the director of Focus Initiatives, Abolitionist Prison Reentry, a project of IDOC Watch, and a member organization of the Indianapolis Liberation Center, and co-director of the Pendleton 2, They Stood Up. He is also the director of Human Rights Held Hostage, a documentary about new African political prisoner, Shaka Shakur. And then the final guest, Two Black, is the co-director and narrator of the Pendleton 2, They Stood Up, and host of the Black Myths podcast. He is the co-editor of Wandering Black Rage, and his published works appeared in publications like Black Agenda Report, Left Voice, and Blavity. So please give it up for them. There's a couple of questions just to get started. If you have your own questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll call on you. So, first question is, for those who are unfamiliar, what is Pan-Africanism and the difference between revolutionary Pan-Africanism and what is the history of Pan-Africanism?
I like how we all looked at me. So I don't know if I need a mic. I'm pretty loud, but I'll take it. We're recording through the microphone. Okay. Okay, so I can just start with how Pan-Africanism has come to be known has mostly been culturally, right? So people would identify it through cultural means, like the garb, like music and things like that, art. But what revolutionary Pan-Africanism is a political objective, which is a lot different from just, taking on the spirit of Pan-Africanism. What it is insisting is that it's a one united socialist Africa. That's the end goal. That is the political objective. So all the work that we're doing in terms of uniting under the banner of Pan-Africanism is with the intention of a one united socialist Africa. That is the intended goal. Now, there are people who talk about Pan-Africanism but do not speak about revolutionary Pan-Africanism because that is not their political objective. But when we look at parties like the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and such, when they speak about Pan-Africanism, the revolutionary part is about the political objective. So I would say that that's the distinction. But then also, I think the danger of not having or understanding that political objective is that you get a lot of charlatans who fall under that banner of Pan-Africanism, most notably Umar Johnson, the pits of Pan-Africanism, who does not talk about any of the what's actually occurring on the continent, does not speak about that political objective, but uses it in a way to sort of weaponize or even push sort of race reductionism or identity reductionism in a way that really centers U.S. Africans and not really take into account of the global struggle of Pan-Africanism while evoking the names of like Kwame Ture and Marcus Garvey and all of those. So that in that sense, it does a lot of work to sort of muddle what it is. But I do think it's really important, especially in these times, because we are in a battle of ideas, that we really understand that revolutionary Pan-Africanism is, in fact, a political objective.
Yeah, and the Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers. I think the only thing I would add to that is Pan-Africanism is also, it is a political objective and framework. It's also a vessel through which we can organize and create a unified African identity. And that's really important culturally, politically, because as we know, our enemies thrive on our divisiveness and our ability to be divided and fragmented. But Pan-Africanism approaches it from the standpoint of us as Africans have sort of a collective history and therefore a collective future and identity together. And so when I travel to somewhere like Cuba, or even speaking with like Afro-Mexicanos, Africans in Canada and different places, in Jamaica, many people who you speak with can relate politically and culturally because they share an African identity. And so in this regard, it becomes a very powerful way for us to like culturally organize as well, because to get us to see ourselves as descendants of Africans and Africans is itself a site of struggle. As Erica was talking about charlatans, there's also this big push for Africans in the U.S. to be assimilated into the capitalist structure. And what Pan-Africanists say, and what we would argue, is that we are not, American or U.S. citizens in that regard. And so Pan-Africanism is really a great way politically to agitate a lot of the sort of imperialist and capitalist propaganda that specifically is trying to target, colonized communities and populations here within the U.S.
They pretty much covered it. I don't really know what else there is to say. I guess the more so thinking about some of the misrepresentations of Pan-Africanism, or at least people that call it revolutionary. So often, the term Hotep gets thrown around as a derogatory term. It didn't originate that way. It really just means peace. But Hotep is a derogatory term, and I don't know if y'all have any other commentary on that, but that becomes the popular representation of it. That's actually why I stopped using it, because it used to be a way to call out in the spaces that we're in what we would call like pork chop nationalists, narrow-minded people who had a very simple view of what we would call Pan-Africanism, and then it became this like archetype or stereotype of this sexist black male who's homophobic, who, you know, a lot of Dr. Umar basically like he's yelling at people, why you with white women, that kind of, you know. And it becomes an individualized identity as opposed to what Erica says, this political objective. So it just becomes about, okay, do I have my beads? Do I have my red, black, and green? Do I have an African name? And all of that. And that stuff is important, but it loses its context, and it just becomes about how you can individually return back to some nostalgia of Africa. And that's not what we actually mean when we say, you know, revolutionary Pan-Africanism. We're not talking about some nostalgia of this perfect Africa, because from a materialist perspective, you can't return back to anything. There is no going back. You can only deal with the reality for what it is. So there is no creating Africa for what it was. And also, there were, as we were talking about Walter Rodney before we got here, but there were some weaknesses in ways that some African cultures were I guess you could say, formatted in which the Europeans and you know, colonialists were able to exploit. You know, so there are also things we need to update to respond to the realities that exist now. So just want to make that distinction from when you see the, you know, the guy with the dashiki in a meme or something, you know, that often becomes the representation of what Pan-Africanism is and the political objective of unified Africa under scientific socialism, and really thinking about the scientific socialism part and not just a unified Africa where we just buy black, you know, or we just kind of like give a head nod to a black person walking by. You know, it's not these really like generic things. Those things can be part of it, but those should not be the main things. And often in this society, it reduces it to those kind of just nonchalant things that don't really require serious struggle, that don't really require any real sacrifice. And that allows people to claim that identity while they do all the exploitation, even if they are African or black people exploiting other African and black people, you know, through working for the banks or working for the imperialist powers. No one has to account for that if Pan-Africanism is just reduced to a cultural form of individual expression that just connects you because you have an afro or braids or something, you know. And we see how that's exploited all the time, whether it's through politicians, celebrities, because they will appear that way, and then they will sell you a product, you know, under that guise, and we'll even tell people who are not African that this is a way to support it by spending with this business or buying this album or whatever, right? So it becomes a way of distortion. So these distinctions matter, so we're not led down that I would say backwards road.
No, to Musa's point earlier about it being a way to unify, I think one of the things that even when we speak about a one united socialist Africa or one united Africa under scientific socialism is the question of land, and that we are always continue to be tied to that land. And I think that is what helps actually unify and organize Africans here in the U.S. to not only see themselves distinctly from the American project, but understand that what the objective means and the importance of the struggle for the land of Africa. So I just wanted to note that too.
Yeah, and just building on both of those points, Pan-Africanism comes from a very strong ideological and political lineage. Some people trace its beginnings to Marcus Garvey, but I was going to say you could really go back further than that. But some of its proponents who've written so much and organized and worked around it is like Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, Walter Rodney from Guyana, Sekou Touré, W.B. Du Bois, Amilcar Cabral, Malcolm X, right? Patrice Lumumba. So this is like, it's a ideological and political framework and objective with roots just as old and what's the word I'm looking for? Developed as any other ideological home or trajectory that you could point to. And then to the point about, you know, the people who call themselves Pan-Africanists simply because they might wear African clothing or change their name, there actually was a concerted effort for several decades to make that into the symbol or the icon of Pan-Africanism, to divert people away from more revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Around the time of Kwame Touré, Pan-Africanism was at a height. You had across the continent in the Caribbean, anti-colonial struggles, independent struggles taking place all across. You had Africans across the Caribbean and the US and Canada watching this happen and then organizing ourselves and being inspired by these anti-colonial revolts, and then realizing in the US we still have a colonial capitalist system. And so Pan-Africanism reached a height. And around the same exact time, if you trace the representation of Pan-Africanists in film and media, this is when you start to see Raisin in the Sun. You start to see all these characters pop up, for example, in shows like in the 90s in Living Single. You know, whenever you see a Pan-Africanist, they were the joke, right? And so in Living Color, there's entire characters created in skits about Pan-Africanism, but this was dialectical because it was happening at the exact same time that this was becoming damn near mainstream among, Africans within the U.S. And so Hiram Rivera, he's an organizer in Boston?
No,
Philadelphia, just kidding. He talks about how there's a campaign to make us marginal within our own communities. And in many ways, it was successful to an extent. Counterinsurgency against us has been very successful in many ways. But I just want to make sure we put emphasis that there's a concerted effort so that way when someone searches Pan-Africanism online, the ones who come up are Dr. Umar or people selling you digital classes, or saying the traditional African family was a nuclear family. No, it wasn't. Right. These people come up, not Walter Rodney and Kwame Nkrumah and Du Bois and, true Pan-Africanists are not the first ones who come up when you think of or when you search for Pan-Africanism, and there's a reason for that.
Or even the existing party, because All African People's Revolutionary Party still exists.
Yeah, and real quick, I think, again, the point about the unification, I think, again, even the unification gets watered down to, again, just very nebulous things, but consider the world we're in and the unification of imperialist powers, of capitalists. You're not fighting that individually. So you're not going to fight off capitalism, or you're not going to fight off, let's be more specific, you're not going to fight off Amazon by just having braids at work or just having beads when you pick up the box, right? Like you have to be unified in a way to actually combat the domination of that corporation and others as well. It's not enough to just have the identity. Because I used to work at Amazon, so I know this very directly. It's one of the most diverse places as far as people I've ever worked at. You have disabled people, you have people of different religions, you have trans people, you have black people, but we all still getting paid shit. You know what I mean? So that in and of itself does not deal with that construct. You have to actually be unified on certain principles that can be organized against that enemy and then organized for, your own liberation.
Excuse me. Thank you for that. Before we move on to the next question, I want to, if anybody in the audience has any thoughts or any questions related to the first question, I want to kind of open it up before we move on to the next question. Going once.
Are y'all shy? I mean, I'd argue that. Restate the question.
Is what's happening in the Sahel, particularly with Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, is that, I believe it's at the beginnings of Pan-Africanism. That was the question.
I'd argue that one could say that it is. I think it's really important to look at what's happening in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in the development of an alliance of the Sahelian states, and really understand the dynamic of that. Because even when we look at those transitional governments, Gabon also had a coup and a military coup, and so did Guinea Conakry, and we see what's happening in Senegal right now. But I think when we look at what's happening specifically in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, there's a sort of through line in the masses of a particular understanding of where they want to be in their nations. So when you see like these anti-French calls and things like that, it's a distinctly different call or even organizing mechanism than what you see in Gabon or Guinea-Conakry. Mind you, everyone had a coup. So I think it really does speak to the development of the masses in those particular regions, in those particular countries, because they are the ones that are driving home the idea that this could be possible. And then you could see that replicated in the language that Traore, and in much of his speeches, where he is thinking about the eventuality of possibly of a scientific socialist or like a one united, but understanding that this is the first steps. But we don't want to confuse that with the particular ideology of these nations, because these are all beginning phases, right? So it can go either way. And then we know the history of the continent in these coups. Out of 104 coups, possibly 3 of them have not been reactionary. Separate from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, which we are still watching, because again, these are new, these are fresh, and we can't really predict, and we don't want to make any absolute statements. But when you look at the on-the-ground organizing in these nations and how they have developed into an alliance and then removing themselves from ECOWAS, you can see that there is something really important developing there that can be the driving force for revolutionary Pan-Africanism as we would like to see it.
And are folks in the room familiar with what we're referring to in the Sahel of Africa? Yes? No? Yeah. So I'll let actually Erica, so Erica is part of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Okay. Anyways, it's a Pan-Africanist party that's actually based on the continent, and so I like to defer to Erica for these kind of things, as we should. But
yeah, I'm not part of the party, but we have comrades who are, and then AAPRP is a organizing member of Black Alliance for Peace. And then we have comrades who are in Burkina Faso. One of our editors of Communist currently is. So we have a different kind of understanding. In 2021, Mali had a military coup that changed the trajectory of their governance, and then followed by that was Guinea-Conakry. The issue with the coups on the continent is that there's no military on the continent that has not been trained by the West. So it's either AFRICOM or the French or the Germans, but either way, there's no independent military on the continent. So that's always something that we want to watch, because when you see these military transitions, and you're like, well, if the military is being trained by AFRICOM, is that a plus? Is that a net positive for us? So that's why investigation is important, because Guinea-Conakry went one way and Mali went the other. And then 2022, Burkina Faso had its coup. And in the beginning of that, there was a discussion with Guinea-Conakry, Mali, and Burkina Faso about creating an alliance. So they were already set to do that. What tipped them over with Niger is the amount of sanctions that Niger, that happen to occur for Niger, because Niger happens to be the largest U.S. drone base in the world. Not just on the continent. And then they also have a CIA base. So the U.S. has a very strategic investment in Niger, which is why, unlike Burkina Faso and unlike Mali, all transitional military coups, by the way, Niger was getting attacked the most. And the importance of this alliance is that when this happened with Niger in August, and then 2 weeks later Gabon, but again, 2 different directions, when it happened to Niger, we watch multiple countries, especially Mali and Burkina Faso, say that if the U.S. steps in or if ECOWAS continues with these sanctions, we will respond. And that's kind of the first time we did see not just Mali and Burkina, but Algeria also, and Mozambique, and all these other nations were saying, in defense of Niger, we will respond. So you did kind of see that the talks of the alliance brewing. But that is, I don't know if that was clear or helpful or if I missed something, but that is the foundation in which the Alliance of Sahelian States was formed, and now they're officially an alliance of Sahelian states. So I don't know if you want to add more.
yeah, I just wanted to add, so it's very controversial for Europeans because they've kicked the French out, or at least they're in the process of trying to kick the French out. They've changed their official language and said that French will no longer be our official language. They want full removal from the CFA franc, the French currency that still robs 14 different African nations that are forced to use French currency, and who are not allowed to hold their own gold reserves. The gold reserves of these African nations are held in the French National Bank, and the French National Bank, their national debt and credit is loaned against these African gold reserves. They have kicked French media out of their country, and there was, in the first few weeks following the coup where they took over their government, they were outside of the French embassy telling all the embassy workers they had to leave. The French was refusing to leave. It was very funny because the French were trying to send in big, massive crates of croissants to their embassy workers, and the masses were blocking the food and were like, no, y'all need to get out of our country. And so here we have an alliance of states who are attempting to decolonize, who are very openly saying our goal is to no longer be dominated by the French and the U.S. and its proxies. And you have the French who are at this point saying no, like it's a standstill. And so similar tactics, the U.S. and France are arming rebel groups, essentially terrorist formations, to create chaos in these states, to weaken these states, and to attempt to weaken this movement.
What's funny is originally they came. I want you to go right. I'm just saying originally the French, like, kind of they never really left, but they said they needed to offer more military assistance in that area because of terrorism, you know. But now that they got kicked out, now those folks, the terrorists, are coming back.
Yep. And then the last thing is, so France uses a majority of France's energy comes from nuclear energy, which is a lot of countries. A majority of their uranium for this nuclear energy comes from Niger. Niger has one of the largest uranium deposits on Earth. And I think the last number I saw was like 68 to 70% of all of France's nuclear energy comes directly from Niger. And so Nigerian leaders, when they said on national television, what if our uranium was used to power our own nation? That was when the French kind of lost their shit. And so I think currently they're in talks with Russia to try to have Burkina Faso to try to develop the first ever essentially nuclear plant owned and operated on African soil. But anyways, that's just like, I think it's a very important backdrop for what we're talking about Pan-Africanism, because it's very active and in movement. The African world is very fiery and red right now with anti-colonial movement.
And just lastly, I would add, because what you said, I think it's also important to understand what internationalism looks like in this moment. So currently, there's the conversations between the AES, which is the Alliance for Sahelian States, with Iran, with Russia, with China. They are very much interested in being a part of a multipolar world. Because of these alliances, Fiore even said, if we're back at Russia next year asking for something, then we didn't do it right. Because they understand that these are allyships that are helping the African towards its goal, but not something that the African should be dependent upon. So we see that there's now, they just broke ground on their first mining, where all the resources will be worked on and provided for by Burkina Bay people, so the people of Burkina Faso. The same with Mali. The reason why AFRICOM and these forces are even there to begin with, allegedly, is to combat the terrorism that has spiked 3,000% since they've been there. Right. And Mali has been able to regain territory, at least 5 territories back from these jihadist terrorists that the U.S. has spent over a decade there unable to do. So you could see that these African solutions for African problems are panning out. And I think that a lot of it has been because of their understanding of the Internationalist Project and what that looks like to invite these people in to assist, not take over. And I think there's a little discrepancy about that, or a misunderstanding of those type of relationships, right? Because geopolitics is altruistic. But also when we are in these conversations, the question is always, what does this mean for the African? And I think that that's how the perspective, especially in the Pan-Africanist perspective, especially when we talk about the question being land, is how we're understanding the development of these alliances.
I just kind of have a question for y'all, because I know sometimes people get tripped up on this point. So you brought up Russia, China, and so there's this tendency to say if those countries are working with Russia and China, it's no different than working with the United States. They're all imperialist powers, blah, 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 blah. So I'm curious getting y'all's perspective on that.
Too bad trying to find a reason not to speak. Well, it's ridiculous, right? I think one of the, again, battle of ideas, I think one of the benefits of people being more interested in geopolitics is, again, they're more interested in geopolitics, but I think one of the downside is that everything is on a one-to-one with the U.S., and nothing is looked at individually, and none of these states is as if all states function the same way the U.S. does. And I think that's a misnomer, and I think that does trip people up, because then imperialism becomes just a word that's used on everyone. There's Russian imperialism and Chinese imperialism. There's even Islamic imperialism now, and none of that tracks, right? Because when we understand the mechanisms of imperialism, especially with the colonies, especially, right? When we look at China and Russia, they don't exist in that same way, especially as an extractive force. Especially with the military, and especially the way that we understand these monetary deals or these plans. Like, there's no debt traps, essentially. But I think that the way that they are propagated, because the U.S. is at war with these nations, especially there's a new Cold War developing, a long-standing one, in fact, with China, the way that the U.S. utilizes its antagonisms towards Russia, with this ongoing proxy war, et cetera, and then, of course, with Iran, and needing it to have a fixture and defend Israel and all of that, that any dealings with these countries are going to be made to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Right, yeah, it's like they really are intentionally trying to sway people from really understanding the use of these nations. And like I made the point, like, geopolitics is not altruistic, and we're not looking for everybody to be kumbaya and friends. But again, the question is, what is to the benefit of the African? Now, if I could say that AFRICOM has existed in these spaces since 2007, has expanded over 500%, and then they're still dealing with the same issues. And once they remove these people, oh, wow, the terrorists are gone. Oh, wow, we can regain our territories. Oh, wow, we can have self-sovereignty and self-determination. So then it's not the same, I think, in terms of how we're understanding the relationship with China and the relationship with Russia. Should there be some criticisms? Probably, but it's also not our criticisms to make, because we're not in that nation. We're not directly dealing with whatever would come from that. And I think the way that the U.S. deals with internal struggles is that sort of chauvinistic way where we want to be able to tell people, this is who you should be dealing with and this is who you shouldn't be dealing with.
Yeah, you're shady for asking this question, but no, I think, well, we live in one of the most propagandized nations, perhaps in history. Okay, I don't mean today, I mean in history. The level of sophisticated propaganda, political propaganda, cultural, et cetera, is deep. And we are very mentally underdeveloped in terms of our understanding of world politics. Even before I ever left this country and traveled, this is something that I knew just by talking with friends from other countries. I was like, shit, y'all are talking about some heavy stuff, But, and so it's very easy for people to gravitate towards very simple narratives, especially ones that somehow miraculously, coincidentally align with the Pentagon. And so, like, Africa and China becomes this big, broad umbrella that we can put anything into to use to demonize China. But I think there's over 54 nations within the continent of Africa who all have their own separate dealings with China and Russia. And so right off the bat, we can't make broad stroke political claims. We're materialists. We know better than that. And so whenever someone makes a claim about an entire continent filled with dozens of countries, that's always a red flag. And so I often say, okay, well, which country, which region are we talking about? Are we talking about the Guinea coast? Are we talking about Southeast, So there's that. Africa is a country to some people. It is a continent. But so there's always that. But then two, if we actually look at the actual data and do our research, China does not create debt traps for African nations in the way that the West, through the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the U.S., and other international Western financial bodies have. In fact, China has erased more debt of African nations than any other country in the world. And they do it routinely. And so the third point is that the U.S. sends in aid. You might get a meal, maybe. And often aid packages, they legally, I don't know if people know this, most international NGOs who provide governmental aid or governmental sponsored aid, they have to buy whatever is the cheapest available. So oftentimes the aid these countries get can be things that are literally out of date or expired or just horrible quality in general. We never talk about what is actually in these horrible aid packages. But China has built infrastructure. It has built the means to develop. And so this is, we mentioned Walter Rodney earlier. He talked about underdevelopment, not as an adjective, but as a verb. It's something that happens. And so the U.S. contributes to underdevelopment of Africa because they do not provide the means to develop. They divide the means to dependency and to be further dependent on the West. Whereas China has provided roads, hospitals, schools, agricultural development in the field of tractors and plows and seed. They have provided specialists alongside Cuban medical brigades. They have also sent Chinese medical brigades to several places. And so, like Erica said, there are certainly places we can criticize. In 2016, Djibouti, along their coast, Chinese private businessmen, corporations, were fishing and were stealing all the fish from local fishermen. The local fishermen complained to their government. The government raised it with their Chinese representative in their party. And those businesses were reprimanded. One of them was sent to prison, one of the owners of one of these businesses. They were fined so much money that they quite literally no longer fish in the region anymore and were required to pay back the government of Djibouti. When has the U.S. ever done that to any U.S. corporation? I mean, the U.S. has literally funded death squads in certain countries to create banana republics. Have they ever paid reparations to any country? And so I think it's so easy to latch on to the big narrative. Chinese people are just recolonizing Africa. But if you actually have an understanding of what colonization means and what development means, then you know that that's just like bogus. And again, if you ever find that you're saying the same thing the Pentagon is saying, then you need to reassess what you're. Take a moment, take a beat, chill, girl, go take a nap, So yeah, that's that.
Y'all pretty much covered that. I think lastly, kind of to point Musa was making at the end about development, I think we here don't think about what it means to be underdeveloped, even though a lot of our communities are underdeveloped. But in the sense that even if you are a resource-rich country, you do not have the infrastructure to actually exploit those resources for your own good. So imagine if you don't have actual roads, you don't have the tools, you don't have the ability to refine those resources. You literally just have the resources coming out of the ground, and then other corporations come in, they take those things out of the ground, refine them elsewhere, build it up, and then sell it back to you in a means that you can't even afford, right? So coming back to the idea of taking a deal with Russia or China, often they have the capital to finance those other things you need to develop the stuff from the ground so you can actually have a country or a nation that can exploit those resources for the good of everyone else. It doesn't mean anything. If all I have is uranium in the ground and I don't have the necessary tools, I don't have the roads to deliver the stuff from there elsewhere, I can't pay my people to do anything, I can't pay them to do any of the labor in a way that actually helps, I don't have banks, if I don't have all these other things built up, I need capital to do that, even if that means I have to intertwine myself with capitalism on my way to that, I still need to be funded. And I think often there's this utopian view that you just see something and it will just build itself. You know, it just doesn't work that way. You gotta have, because over here, if we want to do a project of any form, if we want to build this table, we have to go get the resources, we have to go get the tools, we have to go get the labor. How are we gonna finance that? That's a real question we have to deal with when we're trying to actually govern a nation. And often we're not taught to think about that because we think in these very metaphysical ways because we're not thinking about what does it take to actually govern and build things up. So even when they take these deals, look at if the deal was actually fair or not. Just look at the deal itself as opposed to saying, oh, this nation I've been told my whole life is bad, therefore that's the end of the conversation. Now, if China gives an African nation a bad deal, then you can actually be critical because it's a bad deal. All America does is give bad deals. You know, that's all imperialism is reductive, but it's just a bunch of bad deals. You know, like it's a bunch of deals where one side is going to benefit and the other side remains underneath them, right? So you have to look at the deals themselves and how that actually benefits a nation. And you also look at the leaders that are in place, because another thing that makes it hard, even if China wanted to give a country the best deal they could, if it's some neo-colonial leader, then they're going to pocket that money before it ever gets to the people anyway. You know, so you also have to be like, how do we struggle through the overall nation and the people and the masses are in power? That's why Erica was saying any coup doesn't necessarily mean that that's the will of the people. That could just be the will of another ruling elite within that nation. So you have to materially look at what's going on and not always just make these broad swaths about what's happening.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for all that. Yeah, I was just thinking as the discussion was going on, like the way that in Niger, you know, the military stronghold, like one of the largest in Africa, it makes me think about the connection between AFRICOM and the pivot to Asia policy, where, you know, there's large swaths of U.S. military bases in the Pacific. Okinawa, for example, is one of the largest in the Pacific of like U.S. military bases and personal station. Also in South Korea and then also in Hawaii. So just think about those connections between AFRICOM, pivot to Asia, and the encirclement of, you know, military bases in the Pacific and Asia. Any other comments, questions before we move on to the next question? Going once? Going twice? No? Okay. So the next question is, I think we kind of speaked on it a little bit in regards to like Africa, but I'm wondering about like the connection between what is happening in Palestine right now with the colonial occupation, the situation in the DRC and Sudan, and then also like Haiti right now. So I was wondering if we could kind of talk about those sorts of connections.
I'm learning about this issue. Listen to everybody else.
Yes. Well, I will say we just returned from a conference in Cuba, international. It's a very long title, very, very long title. But it was basically representatives from different movements in 35 different countries. And there was a revolutionary delegation from Zimbabwe there who every single time they spoke and got the chance, they made sure to include Palestine and to talk about the history of how even several of the resistance fighters were trained in revolutionary Zimbabwe a few decades ago. And, I think that the history between the continent and Palestine, and there's kind of two parts to the question, so I'm trying to tackle the Palestine first, but it's a very long history because the history is of solidarity. Different revolutionary African leaders have provided training for Palestinian resistance. There are members who in the 70s and 80s went to Guinea-Bissau to receive refuge and sort of safety when they weren't safe in Palestine. And then there's the collective experience of colonization and having a brutal apartheid ethno-state imposed on your people, having to struggle against that, and then having to live underneath that system for many decades, and then having your resistance against that system demonized. This is an experience that African Black people around the world can relate to in a multitude of ways. And so that's why, any African of any kind of political consciousness who I've ever met has always had very stern solidarity with Palestine. And it's always been reciprocated as well in many ways. Palestinian solidarity with like the Black struggle in the U.S., for example, has never wavered. And then even geographically, when you think about where Palestine is located, that's the top of Africa. Like, let's be real. I don't want to start no debates in here, but historically, Africans have settled in Palestine for thousands of years because they would trek through it on their way to Mecca and to several other different Islamic places. And so even historically, Africa has a very rich history within Palestine and Palestine within the region as well. And so the second part of the question was about sort of what's going on in Sudan and Congo. And I have mixed feelings about this because I've worked on the issue of the Congo for several years now. One of my first articles as a journalist I ever got published was actually about the Congo in 2016. Saying the same thing kind of people are saying now, but what happens is when there's a very big moment, and there's a watershed moment with Palestine right now where you have historic numbers of people hitting the streets, historic number of people talking about it. On the flip side of that, people then start to compare and contrast and say, why is X amount of people not talking about this situation? Or why are we not talking about this situation? And I understand the impulse, but we've also had a movement to free Sudan as well, but the Congo specifically, from neo-colonial strangle that's taking place for decades. We do a week of action every single October in solidarity with the Congo, an international week of action of solidarity with the people of the Congo. And many of these people who are suddenly Congo warriors when it's time to sort of like quiet the Palestinians up, the Pan-Africanists that we were talking about earlier, the fake ones, they have never been involved in this larger movement to free Congo that has existed for a long time, right? The situation in the Congo is not an acute situation the way the situation in Palestine is. The situation in the Congo is the amalgamation of decades upon decades of pillaging and robbing by primarily the West, because the Congo is the most mineral-rich area on Earth. It's also massive. They have the second largest rainforest in the world, and it is the top most agriculturally diverse place in the world. People don't even know that. And so I get very annoyed when I keep on seeing all these people say like, oh, no one's talking about the Congo because of anti-Blackness. And let me do both fingers for that. And maybe there's some truth within that, but also you people weren't talking about the Congo until this happened in Palestine. You weren't talking about anywhere else on the continent. The situation in Sudan in 2023 and 2022, we were talking about Sudan, right? Because again, it's the amalgamation of several years of events taking place. This isn't an acute situation. In Sudan, there was, events that took place in 2022 where Black Alliance for Peace was trying to get the world to pay attention, and nobody wanted to pay attention to it until the Palestine stuff started. And so I think we have to be very, very, very careful of when there is like a genuine call of concern where something is being ignored, and there are very ignored struggles or struggles that are not elevated the way they should be. Haiti, no one talks about Haiti. Haiti is facing a neocolonial invasion literally any day now. But at the same time, if you don't have any backstory, you've done no collective study, you are not in an organization fighting for African liberation who is helping to educate you about the Congo, simply talking about it as whataboutism to draw away attention from Palestine, to me is like doing the work of an oppressor. Like that's, so, but I would implore everyone in the room to learn about the history of the Congo. It is, and I don't say this lightly, one of the most important places on earth because every cell phone and laptop in the room is ran off of the minerals that come from the Congo, and people suffer because of it. But we have to be careful of whataboutism among the left, among our people, because we do that very often, sometimes without even realizing it. But yeah, let me stop.
I think you gave good context to the Palestinian struggle. I think ultimately, again, it's a question of land, which is why Africans the world over can really relate and understand and give solidarity to that struggle. Because again, revolutionary Pan-Africanism is about the question of the land, of a one united socialist Africa. But I think to Musa's point, that has also been my frustration, but not only the sort of flippant way that people are urging folks to get involved or understand the Congo or even Sudan, but this whole thing of free. We're freeing everyone, and there's no one really asking from what. So, because I think the from what really draws the attention to exactly what's happening. If we understood why the Congo is where it's at, it's not just because of bad leadership, but it's also because that's true. They are under a comprador class. But then it's also Rwanda. When Rwanda's whose leader is thought of as one of the best Pan-Africanists on the continent, right? Because rhetorically, he says what everyone wants to hear, similar to the president of Kenya, who is looking to occupy Haiti right now, and Ghana, who is now opening its doors for a U.S. military base because eventually the U.S. has to leave Niger. So they're setting it up in Ghana. And then when you see that these memes or these posters that come across your social media, they're also saying free the Uyghurs and free Tigray and free, you're right, it's free Tibet. And these are things that, right, no, free Iran. And these are things that these are struggles we've already combated and won, essentially, right? We know that the Tibet thing is not what it is, and that's something that the U.S. has always continuously used to attack China, etc. The Uyghurs, it has been debunked for years and years, and there's evidence to that. But it really doesn't matter because there's a new Cold War against China. And then even with Tigray, as sticky as that situation is, there's a clarity that when this was all developing in 2021, that this is a U.S.-backed thing, right? That the Tigrayan people, the TPLF, they are not necessarily the good guys in this struggle, right? Because they're beholden and backed and paid for by the West. But when it becomes an issue of free Palestine and then free all these people, no one's really investigating, right? There's no question of free what, because again, the sort of saviorism that's developed in the U.S., from chauvinism no less, is that this is our responsibility, which is why people are so overtly concerned with the Congo in this moment, when the first things that you hear is since 1996, the Congo. So this is something that's been going on since 96. Why are we amplifying it in such a way right now? Even with Sudan, at no point is anyone saying, well, why is there a Sudan and a South Sudan? How did we get there? You know? Because that is part and parcel of what's going on. It's not just these military entities, but to the point of how do we connect or understand. The question of Haiti is a question of occupation. That's a question of a land question, right? Even we could say that Haiti's been freed or the first black nation, and I think people typically just stop right there. after Haiti's independence and really do not engage Haiti afterwards. Haiti was occupied for over close to 20 years, from 1915 to 1931 by the U.S. That's not discussed. And then again, they had the neocolonial ruler, a dictator with Papa Doc, and then his baby Doc, then his son came in, all backed by the U.S. The 1994, on the 29th, in fact, will be 20 years since the 2004 occupation, the coup against Aristide, who was originally couped in 1994. So that he was also couped again in 2004. And then the UN moves in, and that's why we are here. But again, it's these backstories that people are not concerned with, that they don't really understand the dynamics, right? So then it becomes just a need to just free all these people, but free them for what and to what end? Because if we're saying that Rwanda and then also Uganda are involved in what's happening to the Congo, so what does it then mean to free them? Are we freeing them for what? The West, the comprador class? Are we emboldening the masses? How do the masses understand the situation? These are not questions that are being asked. When we say free Sudan, well, we said that 2 years ago, and we said that in 2019, and all of these freeing of Sudan, it keeps circling people back into these exact same conflicts. So what are we actually asking for, and how do we really understand the situation? And I think that these are really, really important questions, because this is how we get trapped into everyone is imperialist, and these sort of reduction of understanding what the situation is. And these are very dynamic and complex situations that did not just occur because something occurred on October 7th, right? And that should not be the emphasis to where we are trying to then study and learn, because we know that these things are always ongoing. But I think because there is a sort of, again, with the battle of ideas, there is this sort of rising notion that anti-Blackness in and of itself sort of is more important than what's, there's no context, right? So it's just like we could just say, oh, we're not talking about these things because of anti-Blackness, or this is occurring because of anti-Blackness. And even the way that some people are even understanding Palestine, right? It's like, but what about the Afro-Palestinians who make up less than 2%, right? But that sort of fixation on it deters people from really understanding the dynamics, and really deters people from understanding the connections. What's happening in the Congo is not disconnected from Palestine, if not because of the Israeli corporations that are right in the Congo digging up for Israel, like digging up for diamonds. How did Israel become a diamond hub? They don't got no diamonds. So where do you think that's coming from? Or even in Sudan, the same Arab nations that are backing the West are the same Arab nations that are all in Sudan, especially the UAE. They're funding that military, etc. But these are not the conversations people are having. The conversations are not to connect our struggles and then move forward, and how do we dismantle these things with understanding this connection. The conversation is, and I don't even like the term, but it is intentionally divisive. It is intentional to say, we silo off our struggles, to say that what's happening here has nothing to do with here, but we need to be focused here only, because this pertains to Black people and this doesn't pertain to Black people. And that's not a Black internationalist perspective, but it's also not the proper perspective to understand the dynamics of what's happening. Oh, wait.
Yeah. I want to refer people. You wrote an article about hashtag movements. What is that article called?
I forget.
Activism
And U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, hashtag activism and U.S. imperialism. But it goes over a lot of what she said. Because when you were talking at me, thinking about that article, and you talked about, anybody remember Caines 2012? Yeah, that was a tough time. Or Bring Back Our Girls. And these hashtags that will pop up out of nowhere. And I think, Anya wrote an article about how it exploits empathy. Yeah. So your empathy, obviously, to see anyone free in the abstract. You want people to be well, and you empathize if they're going through something, if girls are being tortured or assaulted, or, if there's this evil dictator or whatever. Like, if you don't know any better, like, these things will pull your heartstrings, and these campaigns are meant to do it. And in this digital social media age, you have a whole new set of things, even different than some of the coups we talked about maybe in the 90s and early 2000s, where this hashtag pops up and it's Coney 2012, and next thing you know, we're advocating for invasion. Mm-hmm. And we're doing it thinking we're helping someone. We're advocating, we're giving the United States a pretext to go set up another military base so they can go take more resources and do the thing that they were just talking about. Like, so these campaigns will grab our heartstrings, and they're often like funded by the State Department. Like, you will even find some of these influencers, especially here recently, that are online trying to explain how Russia and Ukraine is reducible to a relationship with your significant other. Or you will find these people are somehow funded by the State Department, or you'll see them at a White House meeting of gathering for influencers. That just happened last year. And, so these people, the state realizes, the United States specifically, and just the West overall realizes, as they always have, like, there's a way to tap into popular culture, grab at your heartstrings, get you to send a bunch of monies to an NGO that's not connected to these countries whatsoever. They can go in, extract more resources, exploit more people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, under the guise of free someone, free Haiti, free, wherever you want to go. So like we've been saying, you have to actually investigate the situation for what it is. And I wouldn't say reading the New York Times or Washington Post is necessarily going to help you with that, unless you know how to decipher what they're saying. But you have to be able to investigate the situation for what it is, because they will often have us, and they'll use things like anti-blackness or feminism or something, the things that we obviously can relate to get us, especially those of us who are younger, to get on the side of imperialism, and then think that we're being anti-imperialists while we're doing it. Mm-hmm. We'll have you totally flipped up and upside down, thinking like, oh, this is the thing we need to do. I mean, Free Coney was just gross. I remember people were hanging up signs on like street poles and shit like that. Yeah. Yeah, Sean King did come out of that. So, but to even, if you see something popping up like that, especially back then, because that was when social media was fairly young, hashtag movements, if that's a thing, hadn't really been invented to such an extent. And that was an early experiment to see how well that could go. And we were all, on like asking Obama to send somebody. And when you look that situation up, Coney wasn't even an issue at that point. He had already been handled by the U.S., so it was actually an old thing. And that's another thing, you'll hear about these old stories, like now they're saying Russia has a nuclear weapon in space, and Russia's been working with things in space for a long time. This story is not even really new. Or you'll hear about a Chinese balloon, that's spying on everyone. That the Chinese, is a sophisticated nation, sends a balloon, to do all their work. They don't have anything else to do. They don't have any other way to infiltrate if that's what they want to do. So there's all these things they send and make us think that we're fighting on the right side, because they know Americans, especially, particularly this white liberal guilt sentiment that even a lot of people of color have. I think I saw someone on Twitter say, white liberal people of color. Yeah. And you get this sentiment of people who don't want to feel like, oh my God, I don't want to be on the wrong side of something. So they're just reactionary and they just jump to the thing if they can prove to you that that's the right side to be on, because you want to feel like a good person. Because we love not drinking Starbucks just because that makes us feel good. We're not going to do anything else to support a resistance. But if we don't do that one little individual thing, we can sleep at night. So they exploit that kind of individualistic, white liberal culture that the United States has, and then these things, when the right comes and attacks, these things are so weak that when the right comes in and wants to attack us on any of these things, we often lose, because we're not supporting shit that really helps us at the end game at the end of the day anyway. So.
Yes, +1 to all of that. I, for my birthday, won a Chinese spy balloon. If anybody has the connect, let me know. But no, I often get asked a lot, by people perhaps not involved in political organizing, why is this relevant? Why should I care what's happening in Africa? Or why should I know the history of colonialism or whatever? And an example so I take Walter Rodney, his book he's most known for was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If you haven't read it, it's also an audiobook. I recommend everybody reading it. Groundbreaking book. But it's thought of as this kind of dense academic book. I think it's on the easier side to read, But I read it with a lot of my incarcerated pen pals. We usually every year we'll do reading groups and we'll study together. And we have been reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa actually in October when the October 7 events happened. And every single time I read that book with any of my pen pals, I'm always like, this is so irrelevant to them. Like, why do they want to read this? Or why am I suggesting this? They're incarcerated. You know what I mean? There's got to be things that are more immediate to their condition we can read. But they love it because by understanding that history, they're better able to understand their own history and position here within the U.S. Because the U.S. itself is a colonial imperialist project, right? Capitalism in the U.S. was born out of colonialism here and has simply built onto it. And so we'll be reading about together, you know, on like speakerphone, and we'll be talking about something that happened that he's writing about in like the 1600s, and he's like, oh, wow, just like such and such and such and such here too, right? Or, oh yeah, the same way they were pitting the native Africans against each other because they knew they could make more money that way, they're pitting us against each other too here in Florida, you know, and so they make connections. I've taken his work, Groundings, which is just a collection of speeches, and taught that to 14 and 15-year-olds who start making like organic comparisons to their high school. You know, like he talks about how in Jamaica, the president at the time, prime minister, banned any book with the word black in the title. Anything. Children's books, Black Power. There's a book about a horse called Black Beauty that was banned. And so I'm reading this with my 14-year-old cousin, and we go very slow, paragraph by paragraph, and because she's a child. And she's like, oh, wow, yeah, in my school, they told us we're not allowed to wear anything that says Black Lives Matter. And I didn't know this. This is a surprise to me. And Black Lives Matter is not revolutionary by any means. It's not like some crazy statement. And so then we start talking and exploring more, and she's like, yeah, and they don't like us to have our hair a certain way. I mean, we're allowed to have it this way, but they'll say something if we do. And then she starts making all of these connections to what he's talking about in the book to her high school. And she's a 9th grader. And so, like, never feel like the history, the context, the stuff that might seem even a little bit academic at times is not important, because that is how we better understand our own situation here. And I will always stand by that. And so, like, we can understand what's happening in the Sahel and what we were just talking about with all these African countries. We can understand that because we've taken the time to read and to research and, like Erica said, investigate. And so investigation is always relevant. It's always going to be relevant, even if you don't realize it.
Wow, thank you all for that. That was really great. So we're kind of running out of time here for a little bit, but I guess the last question here, real quick. The question I want to pose is like, what can we do on local organizing efforts to help support revolutionary Pan-Africanism? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, but I think, one, there are a number of Pan-African organizations. Black Alliance for Peace, we're here, we're one, we're an alliance, so there's several member organizations within Black Alliance for Peace. There's parties, like we mentioned, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, or AAPRP. There's also a lot of local groups like Community Movement Builders, which has a presence in several different cities, and they organize services and programs for people. There's the People's Programs out on the West Coast in Oakland and LA. And so I would say find the Pan-Africanists in your area, your locality, and build connections with them, read together with them, invite them to your events, to your groups. We even on a local level, cultural nationalists, people who are just Pan-Africanists culturally, who are just like African cultural pride, who might not have like anti-imperialist politics, we build with them, because they're still trying to engage in some kind of process of decolonizing their mind. They might be a little off track, but we have the ability to influence them. And so the best way to support Pan-Africanism and the movement for Pan-Africanism is to actually support Pan-African organizers. Yeah. And to support Pan-Africanism as an ideology and take it seriously. Find the organization. I'm sure here in Indianapolis there's a Pan-African organization, maybe. I don't know. I don't live here. But, but seriously, I think that there's also a way that how can I say this? I think we marginalize developments to Marxism sometimes. And so Pan-Africanists for the African condition have developed and progressed Marxism to our specific material conditions. So someone like Kwame Nkrumah, for example, he wrote a book called Neocolonialism, the Highest Stage of Imperialism, building on Lenin's work to define and explain neocolonialism, not just for the African context, but neocolonialism globally, which we're witnessing in Latin America and across parts of Asia. And he defined this by building on Marx and Lenin, but specifically for the African context. And so I think we have to see these texts as equally valuable in our political study. I was part of a formation a few years ago, and it was like, this is your Bible, and then over here is the Apocrypha that we'll read, like once a year, right? We don't need DEI in the left. We need genuine engagement with the work and organizing and writing of colonized individuals. And so that would be my recommendation right there. I think I rambled a lot, but I'm gonna pass it.
I guess since I do live here, I think it's tough here, to be honest, because a lot of the black-centered things have been captured by like more of a black capitalist lens. So you're gonna see a lot of like buy black and things of that nature going on, a lot more basically DEI type things. But I will say part of building Pan-Africanism is also realizing where things are weak, and maybe you can enter yourself in and help build it from there. So this is going to probably come off as a shot, but a lot of organizations around here are weak. And I say that to say, like, you can go in places and you can raise some of these issues, and you may not really get that much pushback because they ain't really got nothing else going on. Especially for some of the older folks, they might be down to hear it to some extent, but you have to be able to organize it in a way where you bring people in, things of that nature. Even when something's not weak, sometimes things just need more compliments. So, like, even when we do the Pendleton 2 Defense Committee, which may not seem on its face like Pan-Africanism if you don't necessarily understand how that works, but for me it is. But part of what, for me, joining that was how to bring those principles into an organization in and of itself, how to bring it into that struggle. So even if we're not the Pan-Africanism Defense Committee, we can still bring those principles into the actual Defense Committee, how we organize, how we share, how we hold conversations, how even the film is edited. All of those principles are embedded in our Defense Committee and how we move and why we haven't made certain choices. And even just bringing more black people into that formation, just letting more black people know that we have political prisoners here in Indiana. Like, all of those things are still, for me, Pan-Africanist, because they're still tied to these principles, because everything doesn't have to come back to the big picture. Sometimes it is just dealing with the stuff on the ground, and when people understand what political prisoners mean, and how, we just talked all these things about Africa, and we were talking about even a place like the Congo and Patrice Lumumba being assassinated, and the meaning of assassinating and or imprisoning leaders who threaten imperialist agendas, who threaten, the ruling class. Like, these things, you can make these connections, like Musa was saying, even with young people, right? So you can go into some of these organizations. Now, I would say, as far as, organizations, I'm a part of Black Alliance for Peace. We don't have currently a local chapter here. I am literally leaving today to go to Chicago for our conference, for the regional conference in Midwest. But that's something for those who are, for the Africans in the room who would like to build, that's something we can build here. We can build a Black Alliance for Peace, and we can talk more about what all of those things mean and what all the principles are. Black Alliance for Peace, gives an orientation, breaks that stuff down. And we can build it here, and you can still be a part of an alliance that's still tied to your local organizing as well. So just because you join one org doesn't mean you can't join others. But it does need to come back to, like they said, some kind of organization. It's not enough to just critique in kind of the abstract or just post online or tell, that's why even though I don't agree with a lot of the Black capitalist stuff going on around here, I don't waste most of my time arguing with these people. I just don't really fuck with them as much as I used to. But I don't really argue with them as much because I don't really think that's constructive. And I will even work with some of them when I can if our principles align, So, we just got a No Name Book Club here a few months ago. It meets on the west side at what is it? Yeah, Jama Bookstore. So that's an opportunity for getting in. So there's different ways we can do it here, but we do need to collaborate on there more. And there is actually a pretty rich history, a nationalist history in Indianapolis that is not really often respected, that we can tap into. There was actually just someone who, Mashariki just passed, who was one of our elders here not too long ago. Was always supportive of any work I was doing. Always had good love for her. She actually came out to the Pendleton 2 screening. It was the last time I saw her. So rest in peace to her. So there's a good history here, but it's not. You got to get past a lot of the black capitalist representation. Oh, we're Black in a white space. Look at us, shit going on. You're gonna have to look past that to find these things. And lastly, even at the library, we have the Center for Black Literature and Culture. Like, just using these spaces that are created and turning them into something, as opposed to just being like, well, I don't like it. We can transform these spaces themselves into things if we want to, because some of our elders did build those institutions for us to build on top of, but we have to engage those spaces. So.
Yeah. So lastly, I would say I think it's important to not just only organize, but actually utilize the existing institutions. Every May 25th is African Liberation Day, and that is celebrated worldwide. It's even celebrated from anywhere from a small scale, like a group of people in a room, to large scale, where we have a whole park event. We bring in all these different sectors of Africans from different ideologies, from the capitalists to the most revolutionary Pan-African. But the idea is to get everyone in that room, utilize this space, but then also talk about these ideas. What does African Liberation Day actually mean? The invention of it. When was this institution realized and recognized? And I really do think it's important because recapturing African Liberation Day was a huge thing in the 70s. Somewhat in the 80s, it lost steam in the 90s, it lost steam obviously in the early 2000s. We've been able to recapture it as more of us have been more interested in revolutionary Pan-Africanism and just actually recapturing Pan-Africanism from reactionaries like Umar Johnson and really insisting that these ideas do work. I think the issue with Pan-Africanism is that it's slated as some sort of failed project, right? But I have a comrade named Max Rameau, and he always says, like, if I apply for work and I don't get any of these jobs, I'm not coming in my house to my wife and say, well, honey, I tried, it just didn't work. No, go back out and get your job. So essentially that's what Pan-Africanism is. We've seen that it's not so much of a failure, but it has been interrupted, it has been disrupted in different areas and different points in time. But it's still, the institution is still going, as I noted with African Liberation Day. That has spread. I think now it's celebrated again in 23 African nations, being led by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. But it's also being celebrated this year for the first time in Bluefields, Nicaragua. It's also being celebrated in Venezuela, and by the Afro populations there. But I say that to say that these are ways that we can connect and really expand on the idea of revolutionary Pan-Africanism and really start to sort of forge an organized, structured way to do that. And that is a way to invite local Africans in this area into a space where you can have these conversations about revolutionary Pan-Africanism. Of course, you could utilize the cultural nationalism aspects, the drummers and the dancers and all of those things. Yeah, yes, and Kwanzaa too, I think. I mean, to an extent, but I do think there's an importance in recapturing these already built institutions and making them what you can make them. Because there's a lot of arguments around Kwanzaa, but I also see the benefit of that. If we already have a group of our people yearly invested in celebrating that, then how do we intervene? Not so much how do we stop them, but how do we intervene in that? Like, what is it on this day that we can do that's distinct from what they're typically used to? That's just some cultural event that doesn't really have any stake in it. And I think those are the questions that really lead us forward in utilizing these concepts and these ideologies that do seem like maybe so far away, or maybe we seem disconnected because we see the figures that represent it, quote unquote. But it is important to recapture these institutions because as African people, this is our ideology. I do recommend folks reading Kwame Nkrumah's Scientism, because you really get an idea of how we're coming into our own theories and our own modes of thoughts, right? Because I think it's really, really important. Because I think a part of it too, right? When we talk about a scientific socialism, the people who are already adamant that socialism is white thing really are turned off by that, and really understand, and not really understanding the importance of the question of land and why and where scientific socialism fits into that question, especially as a united continent. Right, and where it comes from. And I really do think that it's really important to engage the Africans who are engaging Pan-Africanism, who also engage Marx and Lenin and Engels, because they built on these sort of modes of thoughts for their own theories and their own objectives. And I think that's really, really important to understand how foundations work, because then we can then understand how do we use these institutions, right? Because if Lenin says the thing about withering away the state, it doesn't make that these institutions, we can't use them, right? It means we can use them up until. And I think that's really important in terms of how we understand building out Pan-Africanism.
I will just add briefly that the importance of organizing in general. I've learned a lot from the rise of Trump and, the conflict in general between Israel and Palestine. And what I've seen come to the forefront is the arrogance of hatred. People are so much comfortable now to openly express hatred, even making public statements and remarks of genocide of a whole entire group of people in today's day and age. Few years ago, I was wanting to be under the influence of we had moved beyond that level of hatred. But no, it's actively there, it's super prevalent, and now they just get on TV, on any platform, and just openly express these levels of hatred like, they're just letting it all come out. So they're going to express this. The bold, they have become bold. They're going to continue to express this and continue to push this narrative. They're organizing. They are organizing strongly, boldly, and trying to incite minds that didn't even have those type of thoughts there, but feeling some emptiness and void will use that to fill that in. And next thing you know, they have another one lining up to do whatever that bidding is, which is going to be totally negative. So it's just the importance of us continuing to come in these rooms like this and to have these type of discussions and to look for ways where we can continue to learn and resist and create strategies that lead to just a better overall existence for all of us as people who come from these oppressed communities and oppressed backgrounds and have experienced this all our lives. If we do absolutely nothing, then absolutely nothing will be done but the continuation of being decimated and not having a say of the matter at all. So that is the overall importance of why this is so totally necessary.
Wow. Thank you all for that. That was amazing. Any comments or questions before we close out? Yeah. Sorry, could you repeat that one more time? No, you're good. You're good. Yeah. Okay, yeah. A question on propaganda and if it keeps people in the ways of, keeping us.
Erica knows I love to talk about propaganda. I left my tinfoil hat back at the hotel. No. No, the short answer is yes. No, I'm just kidding. But absolutely. Propaganda is an extremely powerful tool, but it's also important to remember propaganda is neutral. Right. Like a lot of people hear the word propaganda, they instantly think bad. There was a time at which our movements generated very, very popular propaganda as well. And I say that to say that propaganda is in a dialectical relationship. It's in a direct conversation and relationship with our conditions at all times. And so when you live in a state where the same capitalists who dictate the policies, who dictate your housing, inflation and the cost of food, the gas prices, who are invested in private prisons and public prisons, when they also control the education system and the media apparatus, academia to a large extent, publishing, film and television, major studios in the world are mostly harbored in the U.S., that dictates every single thing that you see and read on your TV screen. And Walter Rodney, in the same book I mentioned earlier, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he speaks about how when colonialism first began and Europeans specifically who lived in port cities and port towns in Europe like Seville and Lisbon, they were starting to see their cities be built and up more and more and more. The more they saw this African gold and goods coming from the West Coast, the more all of the port towns began to grow and their lives became ever so more slightly comfortable. Nowhere near to the level of the capitalists at the top, of course, who were building world fortunes that are still standing today. But nonetheless, these European workers realized their condition and their comfort was in some way directly tied to that exploited labor. And then later, as chattel slavery comes, the more they saw enslaved Africans get off those ships, the more and more and more, again, their houses got a little bit nicer. All of the roads in the port towns, the first roads paved in Europe were in the ports, right? And so we still have that same dynamic today where outsourced labor, the labor, exploited labor, is in direct relationship with our comfort and conditions here. And so because you don't have to think about the other person on the side of that cell phone in the Congo who's getting that lithium, and you're not taught that it's children who are getting in mines because they have small hands, that they're the ones who are picking the lithium that runs the batteries in your phone. You're not taught this in elementary, middle, or high school. Most college students don't know about it. If you turn on YouTube, Charlemagne the God is not talking about it. On BET, they're not talking about it. What's some more black journalism? The Root isn't talking about it. Roland Martin doesn't, right? And so it's extremely intentional because if we, I mean, and even here, think of how we can own, and I say own because it's slavery, 1/3 of the prisoners in the world are in the U.S. That is such a wild thing to think about. There's billions, there's like, what, 7.8 billion people, and the majority of the prisoners, 1/3 of them, are in the U.S. For something like that to take place and the masses of people not literally be burning shit down and in a constant state of revolt, there has to be a project of propaganda to manufacture that consent. And so, yeah, there is absolutely. If people were more educated and aware about our own conditions and other people's conditions in other countries and how they're in direct relation to, like, you know, I got a nice shirt, meanwhile there's someone in a sweatshop who made it for 27 cents. You know what I'm saying? If people were actually educated about this, the system itself would not be able to stand and function, because even the most unpolitical of person doesn't want a 4-year-old African in the Congo mining for 17 hours a day. You know what I mean? And so, and there's someone you should check out on Black Power Media, Dr. Jared Ball. You go on YouTube, you type in Black Power Media. He talks a lot about propaganda and communications in general as like a tool and weapon against us. The Black Panthers popularized the term information warfare, and they created their own paper, you know, specifically because they felt like there was a battle of information, and we somewhere along the line sort of just like lost that tradition, you know. But this is a great question.
Yeah, you go.
Yeah, that was a good question. I think I wanted to read a few quotes to answer that more directly, I guess. So there was a FBI agent said to a memo to J. Edgar Hoover, who we know was the founder and director of the FBI. Quote, "The Negro youth and moderate must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teachings, they will be dead revolutionaries." Now, this is an FBI agent saying this in the early 70s. I believe in 1972. This is part of the COINTELPRO program, right? Another quote, John Ehrlichman. I'm sure many of you have heard this one. He was a White House counsel and assistant to the President Nixon for domestic affairs. He says, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, that would be propaganda to make that association. And then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them after night on evening news, propaganda. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Right. So these are people who worked in the United States government being very explicit about what was going on. So yeah, it's not an accident that we are more interested in doing things that, you know, are not revolutionary. And some of it is just very material. Like if they want to do revolutionary teachings, they will be dead. So you will talk to many people and they're not really confused about what's going on. They're just like, I don't want to die. I don't want to go hungry. I don't want to be broke. So propaganda should not be confused as being synonymous with like this kind of idea of brainwashing. I think sometimes that's a mistake we make. Some people do buy totally into the idea that white people are better and black people are inferior, and some people obviously buy into that, but other people are fairly clear on what the world is, but the propaganda is also in the material of just being like, oh, this is just a better route. I'm just not gonna die if I do this. or I'm gonna make more money if I do this, or I can feed my kids if I do this, right? And that helps feed the propaganda because that creates like a proof of concept for people who don't know any better. And they're like, oh, well, shit, that looks better. When you do Pan-Africanism, you die. Look what happened to Malcolm. Look what happened to, you know what I'm saying? Like that's what people say. So it has a way of just perpetuating itself. So we have to be able to not just push back against the truth or falseness of something. Because sometimes I know when we talk to people, even on our podcast, people are clear on it, but they're like, why does this matter? Why is this more important? But I always say it's very similar like the lottery. Like, yes, you're going for this big, maybe one day I win, maybe I keep buying these tickets, but most of us never win. So most of us are still suffering, even while we're not pushing back against propaganda, even while we're not, interested in revolutionary ideas, right? So it's definitely part of the state to do that because they understand if most people were invested in this, like you said, this shit would crumble. There wouldn't be any real conversation. But there are real consequences to trying these things. It's not just a matter of people's taste. It's also a matter of like what will happen to you if you do these things. So it gets to a point where eventually people themselves start to discipline themselves. It doesn't even require a gun to be put to my head or even necessarily me to even have to watch a movie or read an article or watch a TV show. It's just, I just know that over there people died. So I'm just going to, socialize myself to not go that way. And a lot of other people do too. So, and then it just becomes the norm. And I never go to see what's over there, because it's just kind of understood implicitly of what happens to you. That's why you do have to defend people like political prisoners. Because when you leave people like that out to die, and it makes everyone else vulnerable. And if I'm seeing that, if I actually stand up, I'm just going to rot away in prison for 200 years and nobody's going to do shit, then why would anyone else want to do it? You know what I mean? So it's not just about, even if you're not the one that's going to pull the trigger, literally, you're not the one that's going to rob the bank, you're not the one that's going to be willing to do those things, we still should create networks for the people who are willing to take that risk. Even if you don't condone it yourself, because we understand that is a necessity of the thing. So it's like when we think about Palestine, right? Like, there's this tendency to be like, well, I hate to see babies dying, but I condemn Hamas or whatever, right? But but that becomes this thing where we are still condemning any kind of resistance. We are allowing the propaganda of lies about babies' heads being cut off and all of this shit. So what becomes the actual solution to getting you out of this situation, right? So if you condemn the actual resistance, even if you're not willing to do it, you don't have to agree with it yourself. But if we're in a position where we're condemning that resistance, then how do we ever get out of it? You know what I mean? Like, someone has to do it, right? So even if it's not us, we need to at least have support networks for those people. That's why you don't really see around the diaspora a lot of Palestinians themselves condemning Hamas. You don't really see that on large. There are some here and there, but you don't really see that. And even if they do, it's fairly vague. They're like, yeah, that happened over there, but occupation is here. Like, let's talk about occupation. Let's talk about what y'all doing to my people. Like they still tend to focus it on that. But again, the point is to make people scared. The point is to make people feel like there is no actual way I can win. So we have to teach people that they actually can win, that we can win. We have to prove those things materially, not just in our rhetoric, but what we actually do, even when they're small wins, that we'd actually win. Because when you can convince people that they can win, way more people would join your side than when they feel like it's a losing side,
Now, I'll say in 1983, Maurice Bishop visited the U.S. He was in Times Square, in fact, and one of the first things he told a student group that he met with after was that the U.S. is the most propagandized nation in the world. The way that information is disseminated to us, it's not like anywhere else in the world, especially on billboards and commercials. It's like nonstop, 24 hours. It's on the newspapers. It's in the news. It's something that we are always seeing. The other thing that's important to note is that the rest of the world is fully informed about what's happening in the U.S., whereas the U.S. has no idea what's going on in the world if there's not a war there, right? We know that once they wage a war, everybody has seen the map about the Middle East, Iran, and Palestine. Yeah, right, because they have played that map continuous, especially what happened in the proxy war in Ukraine. We have an idea of what that looks like because they play that map continuously. But on an everyday, they don't really consider these nations to be nation states that we need to be concerned with up until there's a war. So everyone is sort of getting CNN in their countries, and they're getting MSNBC in their countries, where to get RTTV here or to get Red Stream is getting banned, right? Because there's information that they don't want us to be aware of and have. And I think that we need to really understand the U.S. as a mechanism for that in all media, in the U.S. as a long arm of the U.S. state, because they are pushing particular narratives. I think Ukraine really is one of the better examples of this. I mean, we could talk about Palestine currently, but I think what's really important about what happened in Ukraine is that people didn't care. Well, you can see there's a concern now that people are losing their jobs and they're getting pulled off air. All of that was happening 2 years ago in the beginning of Ukraine proxy war. And people did not care because we have been slated for and prepped for years about Russiagate, 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 right? So to say anything different from that is to be like, yeah, it's to be siding with the genocide of Ukrainians and all the Ukrainian women and the children and the babies in the hospital and all of that, right? And then we've seen notable award-winning directors were getting snatched off the air, and people who had long-time journalists, like who had shows for years, just getting pulled off the air behind Ukraine. And it was just like it happened overnight, and nobody really made a fuss about it. And all of those things set up and prep for what we're seeing now for Palestine, because the less you say about a thing, the more that they're able to do it. And I think even then, our comrade Onyang, who works for Hood Communist as well, she's an editor as well, had wrote about the necessity for a counter-propaganda campaign from the left, because all of these things were happening and we were just not prepared for it. And like to Musa's point, propaganda is a neutral term, right? The power of propaganda is dependent on who's able to wield it. So we're not using propaganda to our benefit, then yeah, we are going to be propagandized by the state. But if we know that we have artists, and we know that we have journalists in our sphere, in our movement, then we need to be thinking through, what does it look like that if BAP and AAPRP and community movement builders, and then the struggle for political prisoners, if we were all to strategize around a campaign of propaganda, that is more effective than all of us doing it individually, right? Because we could all release things and say, well, this is what's really happening and you shouldn't believe this. But in terms of attacking a people who's already being attacked by an organized structure of media, you can't break through that in isolation. And that's the other thing. I think that we're also more susceptible to propaganda because we are isolated. We are not a people, we are not a communal people. And the conditions of our material conditions have made it such, right? We go to work, we come home. We go to work, we come home. We might see somebody in the way, right? We're not really a people that speaks to our neighbors anymore, right? I laugh and joke about rent parties, but yeah, that was a thing. And we don't have rent parties anymore because people don't know their fucking neighbors. Like, people don't speak to the people that live right next door to them. We don't have that sort of community, even though I'm against that word now. I'd rather talk about neighborhoods because I feel like anybody could be a community, right? And that, right? And that's a large problem why we can't organize our neighborhoods, because we're looking for community. But yeah, so I think that it's really necessary to really think about propaganda on a strategic level, because it is strategic for them. And when we talk about being organized, it's with that understanding that we are out-organized by our enemies. And we really need to really sort of hone in and take that back, but that can't be done in these sort of siloed efforts, because everybody is making statements and everybody is saying a thing and everybody's calling it out. So it's not like these things aren't happening, but how do we make it effective? How do we make it impactful? And I think those are the conversations that we need to really be starting to have, especially when we are finding ourselves arguing the same battles, like the Uyghurs, or like Tigray, or like even the election, right? We're back in this cycle of, if you don't vote for Biden and you want fascism, and we all know that that was bullshit then, and it's bullshit now. But if there's not an organized rebuttal to it, then how far are we going to get calling it bullshit? So yeah, I'll yield there.
I just wanted, I can't leave here and not talk about Cop City. I don't know who is aware of Cop City. That seems like everybody is. I live in Atlanta. It was a $91 million project. It is now over a $100 million project in which they're taking 200 to 300 acres in a predominantly black part of the city, one of the few predominantly black parts left of the southern chocolate city. Muskogee land on top of that. And this is one of our last watershed forests as well. They have already cleared a lot of acreage, and we have seen already massive flooding that is predominantly, again, flooding and ruining Black people's homes. And it will help further gentrify the area because they won't have money to repair and they'll move out. On top of the fact that they want to train Israeli occupation forces, they want to invite police forces from around the world and across the U.S. to come and train here at this facility. And so part of the driving force behind Cop City is this Black misleadership class, this comprador class that Erica has mentioned. And like a brother on the end down there said, our opposition is extremely well organized. They're very organized. They're out organizing us in some regards, many regards. And so some of the loudest voices in support of Cop City are so-called Black politicians and representatives who so-called represent us, despite over 100,000 people in the city wanting to take a ballot initiative and say we don't support Cop City. And so Frantz Fanon, who is a African revolutionary, said that the colonial system cannot exist without an intermediary class, a middle class of administrative leadership and representatives of the colonized population who claim to speak for us, but are really just appointed by the colonial master. And so that's what we're dealing with in Atlanta. That's what we're dealing with Cop City. We have politicians who say they speak for Black people, but then when those Black people are against Cop City, we get put in handcuffs and thrown outside of their event. And so I just really want to urge everyone to support the movement to stop Cop City. It is very urgent. The consequences of Cop City are spreading. There's now, I believe, 12 other cities in the U.S. that want to open Cop Cities, 20 plus, see, look, and counting, including in Baltimore, I think $300 million, $330 million.
On a HBCU campus, no less.
And so, on a HBCU campus, yeah. And so to our point about propaganda and Pan-Africanists being marginalized within our own communities, those of us who are against this Cop City movement, we understand these are counterinsurgency, urban warfare centers. They know that we are poor, we are hungry, we are oppressed. People are not in unions anymore. Our labor is exploited, and we are uprising and revolting damn near every month at this point, and they know it's only going to continue to get worse because climate catastrophe is impending. And so all of these Cop Cities popping up everywhere is because they are preparing to repress us more than they already are. And so the Cop City situation is urgent. I urge everyone to, if you're not aware of Cop City, there's an Instagram. It's literally called Stop Cop City. There's Black Alliance for Peace in Atlanta. We've done a lot of work on Cop City. You can just Google Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta, Cop City, a bunch comes up. And the movement to stop Cop City is itself a part of the Pan-Africanist struggle in many ways, but I'll yield there.
Thank you so much for that. So just to close out, I want to thank everyone for coming out here today. Please give it up for our amazing folks, panelists up here. Yeah, this is great. Thank you all. Yes, please check out the merch table. Please converse amongst yourselves. We hope to see you again here soon for another event. Please keep an eye out for our social media, etc.